I'm going to disappear in a minute, but yeah. So it's really great to have you. You're one of the friends of the old meeting. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us, what was it that sort of particularly drew you to, because you've done a lot of study about the old meeting, why did you choose this church as opposed to any other church?
Because the records survive. It really does come down to that. When I was originally interested in early New England Congregationalists, but that had been done. So
right.
I thought I would look at early Congregationalism in this country. And in searching around for the earliest records, the old meeting has some of the oldest in the country. And so they became, and they're actually very full. We'll be hearing about them in a minute, actually. So it was the fact that the record existed that brought me to know about Old Meeting.
Oh, right. Yeah, I was thinking I was going to ask him a difficult question, but
no,
you passed that one. So you've sort of concentrated on the Civil War for interest. So what is it about the Civil War that fascinates you so much?
For me, growing up in the Bible Belt in the States, I became very fascinated with how religion shapes people's behavior, and watching kids grow up in the Bible Belt and deal with all the issues that kids have to deal with, but from a standpoint of faith, I found fascinating. The Civil War period is great for thinking about those issues because it is very much, as John Morrill may say when he comes, a religious war. Religion is at the forefront of the war. Religion becomes not only contested, but individual belief becomes contested. So people react and have to live through this civil war, this revolution, some people call it, this turmoil, trying to act out their faith at the same time, which is difficult for them and fascinating for the historian.
Right. Well, I've been blessed having quite a few little chats with you over the last year or so, and I've learned a huge amount. So if there's people here who've never done any study in this area, could you suggest a really good starting book for them to get their teeth in?
Well, there are a number of little short histories of the Civil War that are coming out right now, actually. A guy named Blair Warden has one that's just come out. Another colleague of mine, Patrick Little, has a new one. These are not too long, so you can dive into them pretty quickly and learn about the Civil War period in general. In terms of religion in the period, there's not a good survey, I wouldn't say, but there are some really good biographies, like of Oliver Cromwell, for instance. There's a number of good biographies of him, which will draw you directly into the religion of this period. There's lots of good books on the Puritans, as you know. But the Civil War period, probably those two biographies, those two works by Blair Warden and Patrick Little are two of my favorite recent.
Okay, so we're all going to go down to the shops and buy them.
I'm going to be asking them for royalties.
Hopefully. Now, I rather embarrassed Professor Halcomb because I asked him what his hobbies were.
Oh, right.
And he really said he didn't have any time apart from reading.
Yes.
So could you do you have any time apart from reading to have any hobbies at all?
Not much. I do try to play music when I can.
What, on a tape recorder?
No. I play bass guitar.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
That's great.
I play folk-type stuff, to say the least. That's probably the closest genre. It's singer-songwriter stuff with a friend of mine in Cambridge, so we play out and about.
Oh, fantastic. Right, you learn something every day, don't you?
That's it, though. That really is about it.
Right, well, I'm going to let Joe... I heard this talk last year at the Norwich Club, wasn't it?
The local branch of the Historical Association.
Yes.
At that point.
Yes, and that was really, really good. And I said to Joe, please, you've got to give that talk here at the old meeting. And he's been very kind, and he's going to do that tonight. So I'm going to shut up. Do listen, and I believe at the end you'll be happy to take a few questions.
Very happy.
Yeah? Okay.
Great. Thank you, John. Thanks for having me. It's always great to be back here at Old Meeting. John is right. It is this place is very close to my heart. I've come to know it well thanks to John inviting me in so warmly to this place and to these talks. And it's nice to connect. I think it's rare, especially for someone of my period, to be able to connect their own period of study, their own history, in this way with people who are very much the inheritors of the tradition I'm going to be talking about. This paper, I suppose, it's about the parish of St. George, Tombland, just up the road, right across from the cathedral. But it's also about the early years of the Old Meeting Congregational Church. So I believe from Heritage Day 2 years ago, I spoke about the foundation of this church. So this paper is kind of a sequel to that. It's really about the Old Meeting in the 1650s. But I'll start. So in 1643, the parish church of St. George, Tombland lost its minister. The parish would not have another settled minister for 15 years. That's until in 1657, when Thomas Allen was granted the living of St. George Tombland by the city's officials. So this experience of St. George is hardly unique to the Civil War periods. During those two tumultuous decades, thousands of ministers across England were ejected from their livings as various royalist and parliamentary forces fought for control not only of the government and land and territory, but also, importantly, the kingdom's pulpits. When Parliament finally won the final military victory, the nation's pulpits were very much one of its prizes. So we think around 3,500 royalist ministers are known to have been ejected during the Civil War period. And of course, with the restoration of the Stuart monarchy in 1660 came retribution. Over 2,000 non-conforming ministers were ejected from their livings between 1660 and 1662. So historians have known about these ejections for centuries, as you might imagine. In the early 18th century, for instance, Edmund Calamy, the grandson of one of the leading Presbyterian Puritan ministers of London, published a memorial of Puritan ministers ejected at the Restoration. It valorized these ministers' piety, their martyrdom, all of this in the face of ungodly persecution. And sure enough, a guy named John Walker, an Anglican minister from Devon, responded with his own account of the trials and hardships of royalist ministers who were ejected by the Puritans during the 1640s. St. George Tombland is just one of thousands of parishes across the nation that form part of this story. So Isaac Dobson, a high church Anglican curate of St. George from 1638, probably left the parish in 1643 when Puritan parliamentarians began to purge the city's pulpits here in Norwich. So he was probably forced out. Thomas Allen, who I mentioned was granted the living in 1657, he was ejected at the Restoration on Black Bartholomew Day, 1662. So here we have a royalist and a Puritan minister both being ejected from St. George Tombland. The question for me tonight is what happened at St. George in those intervening 15 years when the parish had no minister? Did parishioners congregate in the church on Sundays? Did they go to neighboring churches? Or perhaps maybe the church wardens used what parish funds they might have to hire in preaching from time to time. We don't know at all. Historians have had very little to say about what happened in churches like St. George in these periods without a minister. So we have full and rich histories of the breakdown of ecclesiastical authority during this period, histories of religious toleration, and loads of wonderful histories about the emergence of various sectarian and denominational groups such as Baptists, Quakers, and even many more exotic religions from the period. But parish religion has been comparatively ignored by historians, and there's perhaps some good reason for this. Most parishes, at best, only left us their registers. Fewer still left us any surviving church wardens' accounts or vestries accounts or overseers of the poor's accounts that we might use to reconstruct what was going on. There are a number of famous diaries from parish ministers during this period, but these tell us little to nothing about what happened in these thousands of parishes across the nation that didn't have a minister. Diaries from common laymen are even more rare. There is then something of an archival black hole for studying these destitute Civil War parishes, those parishes without a minister. But in a few parishes, the scraps we do have, I think, can be very revealing, and St. George, Tombland is one of those parishes. The only parish records that survive for the Civil War period are the registers, so we don't have any church wardens or vestry accounts. But as we'll see, even those registers are very sparse. But thankfully, during the 1650s, Tombland was home to one of the city's independent or congregational churches. It was home to this church, the original Old Meeting Congregational Church. And the records of Old Meeting, as I was just saying earlier, are some of the fullest surviving nonconformist records from the whole of the Civil War period. From about 1648, the Congregationalists began to worship within the parish church of St. George. In 1652, they built galleries over the west end of the nave and the east end of the chancel. And interestingly, the city granted Thomas Allen the living of the parish in 1657 only after he had accepted the role as pastor of Old Meeting. So the city was complicit in this relationship, as we'll see. So during the 1650s, the Church of St. George was at once a congregational church ran by its minister and its members, and also a parish church with a tithe-funded minister and presumably church wardens and overseers of the poor. This arrangement, this curious arrangement, was really only possible during the Cromwellian period in England, when the Episcopal Church had been abolished and no replacement had really been enforced. But it is St. George is nonetheless one important variant of Civil War religion, and I want to say a few things in this paper about how the Congregational Church and the parish might have functioned in St. George during this curious time of the 1650s. I'll do this by outlining two developments, so it's kind of two parts here. First, I'll talk about the sort of complete transformation of the parish into a congregational church and what that might have looked like. And second, I want to talk about how St. George became one of the hubs of religious radicalism within the city of Norwich during these years. So let's start with the parish itself. St. George, Tombland, I've given you a map on your handout with the boundaries, such as they were. Tombland is a small parish within the city. It runs along the cathedral walls between the two west gates of the cathedral precinct. It's commonly described as a Puritan parish for the early 17th century, but it is better to see it as a strongly divided parish, reflective of the religious divisions present throughout the country during the post-Reformation period. During the 1620s, for instance, parishioners William Brown, who was a city alderman, and his neighbor Edmund Anguish colluded with Bishop Samuel Harsnett to suppress Puritan lectureships throughout the city. Yet at the same time, another Tombland parishioner and alderman, John Tooley, acted as one of the Norfolk trustees. This was a group of Puritan laymen who were gathering together funds to pay for Puritan lectureships. So Puritans in the pre-Civil War period often wouldn't wear the surplice, which restricted them from taking up a parish living, but lectureships, giving a lecture, didn't require you to wear a surplice, so that was one way in which they could at least give sermons. So the Norfolk trustees were a group set up to fund these Puritan lectureships, and John Tooley of Tombland was one of the trustees. These divisions in Tombland would have dominated the physical space of the parish, which I think is useful to know. Anguish one of our anti-Puritans, lived behind what is now the Maid's Head Hotel, what was then called the Maid's Head Inn. Another soon-to-be royalist anti-Puritan, Christopher Jay, lived in the large house you see just up the road here with Samson and Goliath propping up the porch. From the other side, from the Puritan side, Thomas Toft, who was very famous for organizing some iconoclastic riots that ripped through the cathedral in 1643. He lived just this way across Phi Bridge in what used to be the King of Hearts Cafe. I forget what the new name is, just right up here in the corner. His son, John Toft, was a parishioner in Tombland. He owned all of those buildings that line the cathedral wall between the two gates there, Ethelbert and Erpingham gates. Toft joined the Congregational Church fairly early in 1644, right at its founding. Many of the other early founders lived in the suffragan tenements on Upper King Street. So if you know where the Norfolk Club is, just on Upper King Street, right across the street, that whole set of buildings were, during the early 17th century, suffragan tenements run by the cathedral, and a whole series of members of Old Meeting can be traced to living in those buildings, including a guy named William Bridge, who we'll talk about in a moment. So Puritans, the point is, Puritans and their opponents were packed into this dense city parish, which itself acted as a sort of buffer zone between the cathedral and the city itself. And relations were never easy between the cathedral and the city during this period. St. George's reputation as a Puritan parish really dates from the ministry of William Bridge. Bridge was the first Puritan minister appointed to a Norfolk living by these Norfolk trustees. In late 1631, the trustees presented Bridge to the rectory of St. Peter Hungate, which is just on the other side of Princess Street from St. George Tombland. Now, despite having a history of controversy, Bridge gained a license to preach here in the city during a small window of opportunity. In early December 1631, the local bishop, Francis White, was translated from this diocese to the Diocese of Ely. And during the interregnum between the appointment of the next bishop, all management of the Diocese of Norwich was transferred to Lambeth Palace. There, the ostracized and much more Puritan-friendly Archbishop George Abbot granted Bridge a license to preach within the Diocese of Norwich, and a few months later approved Bridge to hold a plurality, so to hold not only the living of Peter Hungate, but also the curacy of St. George Tombland. So that's how Bridge gets in. Under Bridge's ministry, Hungate and Tombland became centers of Puritan preaching within the city. Bridge famously organized what was then called a combination lecture, which brought leading Puritan ministers from across East Anglia here to Norwich to preach in rotation. Puritans throughout the city, we can trace, flocked to the sermons and lectures available in the two pulpits of Hungate's and Tombland. Nonetheless, this period of Puritan dominance in the parish was short-lived. In 1636, Bridge was forced out of the city by the staunchly anti-Puritan new bishop, Matthew Wren. But in another indication of Bridge's popular support throughout the city, a number of wealthy merchants immigrated from Norwich to Holland throughout 1637 and 8 on Bridge's invitation to worship in the English Church of Rotterdam, where he settled to take up his new ministry. Many of these immigrants, who we can trace through shipping records, were parishioners of St. George Tombland, and they were also came back to be some of the early founding members of this church. So names such as Balderston, Cawthorne, Everard, Grundy, Howman, all of these are prominent names both within the parish records of this period and also within the early records of Old Meeting. Any Puritans who stayed in the parish of Tombland would have been deeply disappointed by Bridge's successor, Isaac Dobson. Dobson was a supporter of Bishop Wren and brought the parish church in line with what were called Laudian reforms of the 1630s. So he moved the communion table from the center of the church to the east end, railed it in, and then quickly proceeded to present 60 of his parishioners to the bishop for nonconformity when they refused to receive communion kneeling before the altar rail. I think it's pretty clear that the appointment of Dobson was retribution to the parish for hosting bridge. So Dobson left the curacy of St. George at some point in 1643, and he went on to become the vicar of Grantchester, just outside of Cambridge. Not a bad gig, and it probably fit more comfortably with his fellowship that he held at Corpus Christi College. For the next 14 or 15 years, the parish remained without a settled minister, and we know next to nothing about what went on and how much it functioned as an actual parish. The parish registers do have some entries for the 1640s, but not many. So I've given you a little bit of a précis on your handout here. There were no burials registered between May 1643 and December 1662. There were no marriages registered in the parish between July 42 and November 62. There are some baptisms listed for the 1640s and 1650s. But as I'll show in a minute, these baptisms are clearly recorded after the restoration. Excuse me. I've given you two very grainy microfilm pictures of the baptisms that exist for the Civil War period. Prior to 1643, the baptismal records are in a very clean, consistent hand. But from March 1643 on, the frequency of baptisms, the chronological order of how they're registered, and the hand in which they're registered all changes. And as you can see from these grainy, even though they're grainy, you can see that it's quite a mess. It's quite jumbled. You probably can't read much of it. You might be able to pick out some of the years on the picture on the right. But if you can, you'll notice that they're not in chronological order. What I think is going on here, some of these entries were probably added into the register in late 1662, as best as I can tell from their paleographic evidence. But another set seems to have been added between the 8th and 12th of June 1664, so 2 years later. There are regular entries before, up to the 8th of June. There are regular entries from the 12th of June that year, and there are a bunch of entries from the 1640s and 50s stuck in between. You may also be able to see from the picture in the right, if you look at, there's a little black line running across, which is the microfilm reader, and the 4 entries right above that line, you may not be able to pick out the name, but those are all the children of Samuel Grundy. All of his children, or those 4 children, are all listed together, even though they were obviously born at different points during the past 20 years. What's going on in these records seems to be that some sort of compiler or compilers, plural, were working their way through the families of the parish, asking for lists of their children who had been baptized over the 1640s and 1650s. And as best as I can tell from those that I've been able to trace, all of these families are wealthy families of the parish. So none of the poor families seem to, if their children did get baptized, they weren't recorded into the parish registers at the restoration. So the sum of all this, nitty-gritty from the parish registers, is that it seems that there were no registers kept for the parish between 1643 and late 1662. Where we have baptismal entries for the intervening years, they are clearly inserted into the registers after the restoration. Most of these baptisms probably took place in other churches within the city. So, for instance, Thomas, the son of Thomas Everard, is listed amongst all of this mess as baptized on the 12th of July, 1657, and born earlier in March in that year in the parish of St. Michael at Pleas, it tells us. So he was born in one of the parishes around the corner and perhaps baptized there as well, and then recorded into the parish registers of the Restoration. So, if the church did not have a minister for 15 years and the registers were not kept for almost 20 years, what, if anything, happened in the parish church week in and week out? Was this anything like a parish church as we might think of it as a place for worship? Well, the records of the Old Meeting Congregational Church and some of the diocesan records from Norwich during the Restoration give us some information here. In 1652, galleries were built across the west end of the nave and probably along the east end of the chancel. The pulpit was moved to the center of the chancel rather than along the wall on one of the corners where it sits today. And all of these changes really reorientated the inner space of St. George Tombland into a Puritan preaching house as opposed to the Laudian parish church of Isaac Dobson's time. I've given you a little layout of the current church on your handout. So they move everything around to focus on the preaching, and you can see here this whole design is focused in on the preaching as well. They were trying to create something like this within the inside of St. George Tombland. Petitions for the gallery's removal during the 1670s claim that the gallery was built, quote, in the times of the late rebellion, for the more ample receiving and containing a sect of people called Independents, who in those times flocked from all parts of the city to hear such preaching there as best suited the humor of that sect. Another account describes, quote, a sect of men called Independents who got the church into their possession. The Congregationalists probably got the church into their possession in the late 1640s. So in the mid-1640s, we know that the church was meeting in the lower chamber room in the house of Sheriff Thomas Ashwell, who lived just up near Castle Mound. But they were certainly in Tombland before the gallery was built in 1652, but it seems likely that they took over the church building around 1648, possibly when we have note of some images of Christ being removed from the outside of the parish. This date of 1648 would fit with a period of settlement and growing assertiveness by the Congregationalists. According to the church book, for instance, for the first 3 years of Old Meeting's existence, it only admitted new lay members. No church officers were elected until mid-1647, when they appointed their first pastor, Timothy Armitage, who was also at that point curate of St. Michael Coslemy. The election of Armitage coincided with the election of 4 deacons and the reorganization of church meetings, the establishment of church ordinances as well. So the church book tells us the first communion was celebrated in November, just a couple months after Armitage took over the pastorate. In July following, they established a monthly communion to coincide with Parliament's monthly fast. So they would have a fast on the Thursday and communion on the Sunday once a month. The first baptisms were organized for January 1648. And importantly for our purposes, in August of 1648, the church agreed, quote, that the collection for the poor should be at the public meeting place. It seems more likely that this public meeting place was St. George Tombland Church rather than Sheriff Ashwell's private house. 16 years on then, the impact of William Bridges' ministry had perhaps borne fruit with the full reformation of the church, though presumably to the exclusion of the rest of Tombland's parishioners. The worship services on offer at Tombland would have been divided between public and private meetings during this period, where the Congregationalists had control of the church. And here, the Bury St. Edmund's Congregational Church from this period explains this difference. Their Confession of Faith, which was written about this time in 1655, professes, quote, "We do believe that communion of saints, prayer, hearing of the word preached, and singing of psalms are ordinances and appointments of Christ for conversion and edification of souls and for the worship and service of God, and that baptism and the supper are sealing ordinances unto believers only." At Old Meeting and all the other congregational churches that we have record of in the British Isles during the 1650s, ordinances for conversion and edification were open to the public, and the sacraments were restricted privately to full members of the church. These converting and edifying ordinances received more comments in the Old Meeting church book, and they tell us something of what was perhaps on offer at St. George. The church book lists numerous days for fasting, humiliation and thanksgiving, ranging everything from Cromwell's great victories in Ireland and Scotland in 1649 and 51, for days of humiliation for the church's own failing, days of humiliation for the death of Timothy Armitage in 1655 when they lost their first pastor. Besides these prayer days, in August 1649, the church agreed to sing songs in public and authorized Armitage to direct them in such psalms in the vulgar translation as are most agreeing with the original, to be used at the hearing of the word, so along with the sermon, and upon other occasions to sing according to such other translations as shall be thought fit. So Armitage would have gone out and found a sort of metrical version of the Psalms sung a cappella. In 1651, the church allowed select laymen to preach or to exercise their gifts, as it was called, and they allowed them to do this publicly on certain weekdays, so not on the Sunday, but on the weekdays. And this also, no doubt, took place within the Church of St. George. Lay preaching had proved extremely controversial in the early years of the Civil War, but by the interregnum, congregational churches around the country had been formalizing this process, and we know a little bit more about it from some of these other records. So the great Yarmouth Congregationalists, for example, every third week they would have some of their prominent lay members answer questions put forward by the public in order to educate non-members in both theology and church practices, and they allowed these laymen to take a leading role in this. The teaching elders at the Congregational Church in Beccles did the same, but they normally summed up and clarified any of these public exercises by laymen, so they would have the final word, as it were, to correct any theology that might not have been firm. Old Meeting seems to have conformed to this pattern. Well, who could become members of this congregational parish church? Congregationalists, as you may know, had restricted membership. They restricted membership to the visible saints, that is, anyone, male or female, who could prove an orthodox confession of faith, repentance from sins, and a godly conversation, as they called it during this period, godly behavior. The Old Meeting Church Book says little, actually, very little about its membership requirements. It does list its covenant, which all members had to sign up to at their joining. But the only tidbit we have about its membership process came in 1650, or was recorded in 1650. Then the church resolved, quote, that it is not necessary for everyone that desireth to join the church to render an account of the hope that is in them for salvation in public before the church, nor to give in public the reasons of their desires to join themselves to the church, seeing many are so weak as they cannot speak before a public congregation. I think there are 2 points worth noting here. First, prospective members were expected to give an account of the hope in them for salvation. This probably doesn't mean, as many scholars have assumed, that the church required a prospective member to give a full narrative of their conversion experience. The church probably tested for an orthodox confession of faith, evidence of repentance from sins, and of godly behavior. These 3 elements, theologically speaking, were much more biblically explicit, and it seems like those churches that required some sort of conversion narrative were a small handful of what's called fifth monarchist churches. I can say more about that if you want in the questions. So that's one thing. They were looking for not a conversion narrative, but some sort of religious experience, conviction of sin, as well as orthodox belief. Secondly, I think we should learn from this that the church preferred a public declaration from prospective members at their joining, which intended, they said, to edification. So this hopefully was a public display, although they were willing to grant some people leeway here. I think they mean by public that people from outside the church could come in and witness a new member joining, because that would be an effective witness. So Tombland parishioners who were not members, who didn't go through this process, had to seek communion and baptism for the children abroad, presumably in one of the other parish churches of the city, where the minister was more willing to administer the sacraments promiscuously, as the Congregationalists would have said at the time. So the religious experiences of the parishioners of St. George Tombland were partly shaped by those practices on offer by the Congregationalists, but they were not simply determined by those services. For Tombland's Congregational Church was one of the most prestigious in the country at this time, and with its sister church in Great Yarmouth, it oversaw the growth and development of Congregationalism throughout most of East Anglia during the Civil Wars and well into the Restoration. This church had strong links with the Cromwellian government in London throughout the 1650s, and as such, it was one of the most respectable and influential Congregational churches in the nation. But early Congregationalists stood on the boundaries of Orthodox Calvinist belief. According to many contemporaries and many historians since, Congregationalism provided a sort of gateway drug into more radical forms of religious belief, such as believers' baptism, Quakerism, and this fifth monarchism, which I mentioned, which is a sort of a millenarian movement who was directly set against Cromwell and was even, for some of them, willing to take up arms to oppose Cromwell in hopes of the imminent return of Christ. So while the Tombland Congregationalists might be respectable to some, others viewed the church as dangerous, and its reputation was constantly attacked and defended throughout this period. The parish of Tombland, therefore, became associated with a controversial church, and a quite famous one at that. As a way of teasing out how some of these issues might have been experienced at the time, I want to talk you through one of the most dramatic disciplinary cases in the Norwich Old Meeting Church Book. And in doing so, I want to look at this case both from the viewpoint of the church, but also from the two women who were involved. And finally, I'll say something about how this might have affected the parish community at the end. So I've given you on your handout the full transcription of these disciplinary cases, along with a couple pages of a pamphlet, which you'll hear about in a second. So to the case. In May 1650, so a year or so after the regicide, the execution of Charles I, two women of this church were hauled up before the congregation for disciplinary procedures. Both had, quote, diverse times forsaken the church assemblies upon the Lord's Day and spent time with very scandalous persons in vain, foolish, and profane discourse. One of the women, Elizabeth Thurston, had absented herself from her family 2 days together, refusing to let her husband know where she had been. She'd in fact gone to Great Yarmouth to make things even worse. She'd gone there by boat to a house of evil report. There in Yarmouth, she drank and behaved, quote, loosely and filthily in a yard or garden with bomb bailiffs and other debased company. The other woman, also Elizabeth, this one Elizabeth Townsend, had been caught with a group of people reading a book called A Fiery Flying Roll, published the year before in 1649. I've given you the title page and the first page of that on your handout. This is a famous ranter text written by Abiezer Kopp. The group that Townsend was a part of read this book and fell about into, quote, much foolish laughter after reading the text. She had also been caught inquiring with a local wizard about whether a local young man was going to take a certain maid to be his wife. And there are other accusations levied at her, as you can see. While cases of religious radicalism can be found throughout the surviving church books of this period, most involve ministers who turn to believers' baptism or Quakerism or something like that. The cases of these ranter women is rare. In fact, so far it's unique. I haven't found another case like this yet. Ranters were extreme antinomians. That is, they believed that they were above the law. They believed that if you were saved by faith, then you were no longer bound by the law of Moses. And in its most extreme form, having sex with your neighbor's wife, if done in faith, was not a sin to the view of the ranters, or at least to the view of those who were terrified by this antinomian theology of ranters. So this is radical stuff. Copp's book was one of the most notorious books of the entire period. It was burned by the common hangman at Parliament's instruction in London. And the fact that, so it was a very difficult book to get a hold of, and the fact that a group of people here in Norwich were reading it after that burning is quite remarkable. So what exactly should we make of our Norwich ranting women? Interestingly, the church accused neither woman of unacceptable theological beliefs. It was their scandalous and stubborn walking, either their behavior throughout the disciplinary process, that resulted in them being cast out of church communion. In disciplining the women, the church proceeded carefully according to the biblical guidance for church discipline outlined in Matthew 18, verses 15 through 17. These are very, very famous verses. Perhaps you know them, but they're worth reading for the sake of what we're talking about. So starting at verse 15, moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear you, thou hast gained thy brother. But if he will not hear thee, then take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church. But if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as a heathen man and a publican. So this is the form of discipline leading up to excommunication in most Christian traditions. As the church book makes clear, both of these women were repeatedly admonished in private by church members before finally being brought up before a full congregation of the church in May 1651. And this final case would have taken place presumably there in St. George's Church. Both women remained unrepentant, so the church was forced to withdraw access to communion on the 30th of May of that year. And then in August following, quote, upon further waiting and means used to reclaim them and no good effect appearing, they were both cast out of the church. Now, one story we might take from this case, then, is that of careful, biblically based church government. Congregationalism was built around a particular emphasis on primitive New Testament ecclesiology. According to their own records, congregational churches around the country practiced and defended the pattern of discipline laid out in Matthew 18. We can trace this in explicit references to Matthew 18 in many of the disciplinary cases that survive from this period. In Norwich, for example, 3 of the 5 articles in the church's foundational covenant, which I think might be listed back in the back of the church here, focused on discipline and mutual watch, which was all related to this. Members had to agree to walk in the ways and ordinance of God according to the written word. They were to humbly and willingly submit themselves to the government of Christ, and they were in all love to improve their communion as brethren by watching over one another, and as needs shall be, counsel, admonish, reprove, comfort, relieve, assist, and bear with one another, serving one another in love. These principles were put into practice, it seems, in the Townsend and Thurston cases and throughout other congregational churches at this time. Sins were often outlined with references to biblical verses. Some churches labored for months, even years, to reclaim wayward members, and the limited number of excommunication cases recorded in all of these church books from the period suggests, at least to me, that these practices could be largely successful in limiting many of the powerful theological changes taking place during these tumultuous 2 decades. Though the church lost 2 members, perhaps it lived up to its own beliefs and exercised church discipline with decency and care for the souls of the women under its charge. There is, however, another storyline that can be found. This alternative view, perhaps that of Townsend and Thurston, struggles to break through the only account we have of this trial, of course, which is the tidied up account recorded in the Congregational Church's own records. In their view, the challenges and social realities of this English Revolution are perhaps more powerfully evident. Thurston and Townsend became involved in their scandalous behavior through their friendship group, who appeared to be all young adults, as best as I can tell. The church book records Townsend cavorting with Daniel Buck, Samuel Puckle, and other very scandalous persons. And Thurston's crew were named as Puckle, Locklear, and others. The "and others" here suggests that all the men actually named in the church records were known to the church. Daniel Beck certainly was. He joined the church on the 21st of October, 1647, the exact same day that Elizabeth Townsend joined, and Thurston joined a few months later. So they all came into the church roughly around the same time. They were a group of young visible saints at their joining. Samuel Puckle does not seem to be a member of the church, but he was presumably a relative of the 5 Puckles who were a member of the church at this time. Locklear remains a mystery, but the church book suggests that he kept this house of evil report in Great Yarmouth that Thurston and Puckle traveled to. So perhaps he was known by some of their fellow Congregationalists in Great Yarmouth. So here we have a group of young Puritan men and women who get tempted into reading one of the most scandalous books of the whole period. They're drinking, they're visiting wizards, they're doing and saying scandalous things, and all of these things are in direct opposition to the practices and beliefs of their church, of this church. The church's accounts clearly record attempts to prevent Townsend and Thurston from hanging around with these scandalous and profane men. They solemnly admonish Townsend not to keep company with such profane and scandalous persons. And although she had told members of the church that she did dislike their ways and saw evil in them, yet she still frequented their wicked company. Thurston met these men in a house of very bad report, I presume here within the city. She too, at one stage of discipline, acknowledged their company to be evil and promised to forbear going to the house, yet she was soon after found frequenting the same house to drink with the scandalous company. These initial disciplinary attempts failed miserably for all involved, I suppose. Both women became combative, obstinate, and bitterly critical of the disciplinary process. When warned that the church might cast her out, for example, Townsend retorted that the church was no church, for God's love was alike to all. That's a ranter idea. In another private meeting, she claimed that she could satisfy the church in terms of this whole process, but it must be only in words, and she must then play the hypocrite, for her judgment was for that company forbidden. More cutting still, she claimed that she would as willingly live in any prison as in the church, or words to that effect. Finally, both women refused to hear the church or to attend disciplinary procedures after this confrontation, and it's that obstinacy, that refusal to engage, that led to their excommunication. So in their storyline, perhaps, these disciplinary procedures were a bitter failure, and the congregational practice of mutual watch became, at least one of them, a prison. Reading against the grain of the church book account, we can perhaps see how congregational mutual watch could be perhaps suffocating at this time. For instance, how exactly did the church know that Beck, Puckle, and Townsend specifically fell into much foolish laughter when reading Cope's fiery flying roll? Who saw them frequently going to drink at a house of very bad report? How was the church scribe able to record Thurston's vain discourse verbatim in a house as far away as Great Yarmouth? Due diligence in church discipline could be seen as either an impressive effort to save souls, or perhaps as an oppressive, perhaps even obsessive prison of surveillance. Whichever reading we take, and I speak as a historian here, they're both equally valid. The case of Townsend and Thurston cut to the heart of lived religion and social experience amongst Puritans during this English Revolution. For these women and their church, this battle for souls and individual liberty played out in the streets and alehouses of Norwich and filtered through the godly and apparently ungodly networks that connected Norwich and its port city of Great Yarmouth. Radical and illegal books in this story traveled quickly from London and caught or produced a real moment of intentionally provocative and deviant behavior within the midst of one of England's most godly and respectable congregational churches. The two women brought the most radical religious ideas of this whole period right into the parish of St. George, Tombland. Their behavior was public, and the church no doubt reacted to protect its reputation as much as to reclaim these women, and I don't think that's exclusive one way or the other. So I want to finally briefly return to the original question. What was going on in St. George Tombland Church during the Civil Wars and interregnum? Was this a parish church in any sense? It's probable that during the mid-1640s, the parish church went largely unused. It had no minister during these years, and to date I've found no proof that any baptisms, marriages, or burials were performed in the parish. During the interregnum, however, during the 1650s, St. George acted more as what I want to call a city church. In Norwich, the dense population and numerous medieval churches allowed for a variety of religious practices to emerge throughout the city, each catering to their own particular constituency, and this development was sanctioned by city officials, at least to some extent, and indeed the Republican government in London. Under this English Republic, and with the particular influence of Oliver Cromwell, England's first free and open religious marketplace emerged. But what's really fascinating, to me at least, is that this marketplace existed under the umbrella of the National Church of England. A variety of denominations, if that's the right word for this period, existed within the parish churches of this nation. These various churches were led by ministers who took their funding from the state quite often, be it through tithes or augmented salaries funded by local cities or even the central government in some cases. So on the one hand, this stands as a remarkable achievement of religious toleration and coexistence, especially coming so quickly after the bitter divisions that helped spark the bitter religious divisions that helped spark the Civil War to begin with. Yet on the other hand, those divisions remained ever present. From the 1630s, when Bridge turned Tombland into a Puritan preaching house, till the 1680s, when High Church Anglicans finally won their battle to remove that gallery standing above the altar in St. George Tombland. Over this 50-year period, rival religious groups within the parish struggled for control over the parish church and, of course, over the types of religious services on offer there. Tombland's period as a hub of religious radicalism in Norwich was brief, but its history throughout the 17th century, I think, reflects the broader turmoil and conflict of early modern England. I'll stop there. Thanks. Yeah.
I'm interested by this man Timothy Armitage.
Yeah.
Do you know how he reconciled in his own mind the Europe that's named in church for the Congregational church? And did he, for example, say that the bishop wasn't necessary?
Well, so the Episcopal Church is abolished in 1646, so it's gone. There's no bishops when he takes over the next year, 1647. He had nonetheless been a curate in the city, I think, since about 1643 down at St. Michael Colslaney. But the bishop wasn't in power, effectively. Joseph Hall was living out on Haim Road, and the cathedral was being ripped apart by iconoclasts and being taken over by the city. So he wouldn't have really had to endure any sort of oversight, episcopal oversight, which would have left him and just would have left every other minister largely free to organize their parish church however they wanted. They had to do this in a way to not get in trouble, in this case, not get in trouble with city officials, probably, but also parishioners who were upset with you could petition Parliament. There was a number of committees in London that hundreds of people traveled down to complain about the minister if they didn't like them. So you had to toe a careful line, even though there was no official structure requiring you to do this, that, or the other. So we don't have any account of him. We have a few sermons that survive from him, but I'm not aware of any letters or anything really. So we know very little about Armitage other than his sermons and what's in the church book. But I suspect he would have been comfortable with that arrangement because he had quite a bit of autonomy. What I don't know is what his relationship was, because he remained minister at St. Michael Colslaney while he was pastor of the Congregationalist meeting at St. George, and I don't know how he would have organized his Sundays. Interestingly, his children are not baptized in the Congregational church here. Some of them are registered in the parish registers of St. Michael Colslaney, and then at his death, I believe the first one it was registered in the Yarmouth church book. So he dies, his wife is pregnant at his death, and that child is baptized in the Great Yarmouth Church, oddly enough. So I don't know how he managed his Sundays. I would love to know more. I'm still trying to find out how, some other examples of how people manage that, actually. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned about the singing sound. I thought you had to against church music. Is that correct or not?
Well, they certainly weren't against singing psalms. Some of them were against musical instruments in church. Some of the more radical ones were against musical instruments in general. But they were very divided on it. There's a number, Oliver Cromwell, for instance, is very famous for enjoying music when he becomes Lord Protector at the court in London. There's the leader of the Bristol Congregational Church, which becomes Baptist later on. He gets disciplined by his own congregation for enjoying music, secular music. There's a big debate over whether you can sing hymns in church. Most of the churches I have evidence for will say you shouldn't sing hymns in a church service. But interestingly, one of the East Anglian Congregationalists, Samuel Crossman, who's quite radical. He's like a fifth monarchist down in Sudbury in Suffolk around this time. He conforms to the church and becomes quite famous hymn writer. So you can find his hymns in the prayer book or in the Anglican churches in their hymn books. So he was obviously comfortable with it. But most of them will just say that they sing the Psalms, and they'll be very particular that it's a true and faithful translation, meaning it's not a translation changed to sound better while they sing. It's metrical, but that's as far as they'll go. So the closest, I take it there's probably some churches in England that still sing metrical psalms, but I've only experienced it up at the Free Church in Scotland where I lived for a couple of years. So it would have been presumably how they ran it. Yeah.
As the Church of England.
Yeah.
Were there any other groups at all? In knowledge?
Well, we don't really know. I was hoping one lady that comes occasionally to these talks, Alison Smith, she has told me that she's found evidence that there's some Baptists within the city meeting at one of the pubs. one of the ale houses, or inns probably, would be more likely. But I haven't got the reference for her, and I don't know what time period that is. One of the founding members of this church, Daniel Bradford, he has a journal that seems to have survived that I found a transcript of, and he becomes an army officer, and he recounts in his journal where he brings this Baptist minister that he meets in the army, so he must have been an army chaplain or perhaps even a soldier who was a preacher. He brings them here to Norwich and as a possible first minister for the church in 1645, so 2 years before Armitage is appointed. And he records this debate over infant baptism between this guy and William Bridge, who comes over to debate him in front of Bradford and possibly others. I don't know. Bradford only mentions the three of them being present, but it's likely that it would have taken place in one of the houses here, perhaps with quite a few others around, especially if Bridge came over. So there may have been, it seems likely to me that Baptists would have come into the city from that point, but we have little to no evidence of it. One of the Presbyterian ministers in town, John Carter, who for much of the period was minister at St. Peter Mancroft, in one of his publications he complains about a whole range of exotic religious beliefs that exist here in the city, from Seekers to Baptists to Adamites and others, I think. But it's a passing comment. We don't know if he's just upset or whether he's actually come across groups of these people. Or it's also the second city in the nation, so there are lots of people coming through. So to what extent he was concerned about people, radical believers coming through the city, or people actually here in a settled way is impossible to tell for me at this point. But as far as I'm aware, the first Baptist congregation starts in 1667, but it may be that this group meeting in one of the inns and ale houses might have been an earlier form. There were Quakers here from 1655, but nothing as early as this. There are very few gathered churches actually anywhere in the country in 1643. I've counted, I think, about 11. So the Great Yarmouth and Norwich churches are two of the earliest in the country. There's quite a few in London, as you might gather, 6 or 8, but there's very few out in the provinces, and these are two of the ones we do know about. Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes, they courted him heavily. It took some persuading. He'd been in the city since 1652. He had returned from New England. He was a preacher here in the city, I believe at maybe St. Edmunds or St. Clement's during the 1630s, and he was kicked out by Bishop Wren, and he went to, instead of going to Rotterdam like Bridge did, he went to New England. And then he returned and took up ministry here, I believe in 1652 in the city. And the church book records quite some time, almost a full year of courting Allen to become their minister. And they pull out all the heavyweights. I mean, all of the wealthy of the parish are sent to talk to him. Any member of the church with connections to the city, alderman, there's a recorder, there's quite a few prominent people in the church. They're all sent. There's one knight that seems to be in the church, a guy named Sir Henry Clark, who I still need to find out more information about. He's sent over to try to persuade Allen. A lot of those negotiations are in the church book, but he finally relents. And it seems to be he relents because the city is willing to give him the living of St. George Tombland, which had been vacant, so he'll have a salary. I'm sure the church probably paid some of his salary, but it's an additional salary to help pay him. So it's kind of surprising that it took a little bit of persuading, but he did take over the ministry and then remained the minister for quite some time, I believe. I'll have to look down there. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so it's a long relationship once it gets going. Yeah.
We often talk of the new bridge with this church, but in actual fact, Bridge
No, I mean, well, we don't really know. So the first incarnation of this church would have been the joint church of Yarmouth and Norwich, which consisted of a group of followers of Bridge who went to Rotterdam with him and came back. They started the process of gathering in June 1642, so very early on, and they did gather a church, and that church met in both Norwich and Yarmouth, presumably at houses, for a little while, and it eventually settled in Yarmouth. I suspect Bridge was, when he could, traveling in between, trying to minister to both sets of people in the two cities. But Bridge, of course, becomes a member of the Westminster Assembly in London from September 1643, and he is an active member of the Westminster Assembly. So, and he also takes up one of the morning lectureships at St. Margaret's, the church for Parliament, right there by Westminster Assembly. So he must be spending most of his time in London throughout much of the 1640s. And in fact, the Great Yarmouth records record huge efforts by them to find a second minister so that they can have some preaching. They finally hire a guy named John Oxenbridge. And the Norwich church then starts asking if Oxenbridge will come over and occasionally preach to them. So they're obviously wanting preachers in that period where they don't have a minister, and they're trying to use their brethren over in Yarmouth as much as they can. It's impossible to say how much Bridge himself comes here. We can say that he was fundamental to the founding of, to the establishment of Congregationalism in those founding members. The actual gathering of this church, he wasn't present. John Oxenbridge was present, and then a guy named John Phillips at Brentham was also present, two Congregationalists. But Bridge was away in London at the Westminster Assembly. So he had a dramatic influence over, or a powerful influence over the early members, but he wasn't necessarily around a lot to shape a lot of this church's practices.
Did he have a family?
Bridge. Yes, he had a wife, Elizabeth, I believe. I forget how many children off the top of my head he had. He did have some children. I've not thought a lot about his family. I can go and look that up now. Yeah. He definitely had a child in Rotterdam, because there's a wonderful story of Daniel Bradford, who this journal I mentioned. Bridge and Bradford and Bridge's son are walking through, presumably, the streets of the countryside around Rotterdam, and they have to get over this puddle, and they have to lift the kid over the puddle because he's not big enough to jump yet, and it ends up in the next Sunday's sermon. Presumably, I forget off the top of my head, but something about being helped by the Lord or your dad.
Any more questions? Oh, thank you very much. Great job. We all learned something tonight, didn't we? Thank you ever so much.
Great, thank you.
I wish you'd be the assistant pastor, because he knows more about